Yeah, and this one is called.
Okay.
Somehow when you walk.
All right. Hey, folks, we're going to get started. I'm Leonard Segel. I'm the Executive Director of Historic Boulder. Many of you know me, and if you don't, get to know me tonight. I'm an architect, and I've lived in Boulder for about 35 years. And of this effort with the museum to celebrate the anniversary, the 100th anniversary of Central Park. And there have been lectures before, and I'm kind of batting cleanup tonight. So hopefully there'll be some interesting takeaways for you. And I'm going to get started. Let's see. I think I need to get started. Really the point of my presentation tonight is to reinforce how important the Central Park has been to the life of Boulder. And my presentation is, I'm not exactly sure how long it's going to be. It might be an hour, it might be 45 minutes, it might be 35 minutes, depending on how fast I talk. So I'll try to slow myself down a little bit. There are a lot of images in my presentation, and many of them, especially the historic images, come from the great archive of the Carnegie Library. So I just want to get that out there to thank them. I'm going to be adding tonight to the stories that have been told about the park this month by Ava Hamilton, Peter Pollock, and Claire Brandt. Ava explained how the region has been important to the indigenous people who have lived here for thousands of years. Peter described how city leaders worked to transform Boulder at the turn of the 20th century from a Wild West industrial town to a white-collar academic and scientific mecca, utilizing many of the principles of the City Beautiful movement, including creating parks like Central Park and Greenbelt open spaces. And Claire described how the creation of the larger civic center area, of which Central Park is the hub, was achieved at the expense of the displacement of minority populations of Black people and women. Their stories are compelling to make the case that this area is the historic district, historic heart of Boulder. And let me try to advance this. I'll get the hang of this in a second. So here we are. This is a map from 1938. You can really see that this neighborhood was in the bullseye of the environs of Boulder. As an architect and historic preservationist, I thought it would be important to tell you about the long history of structures that have been erected in this area. Central Park has many character-defining elements in and around it that contribute to its vibrant and historic appeal. Some of these structures were recommended in the civic area master plan created by the planning company Olmsted Brothers in their design of 1923. It is an eclectic group of structures, which each telling a contributing story of the evolution of Boulder and the civic area. And I'll be explaining this story in 4 chapters. The first covers the stretch of time well before and leading up to the opening of the park. The next chapter is about the early days and early years of the operation of the park and how the structures impacted the community. The third time period covers how the park structures have influenced this neighborhood in more recent memory. And finally, I'm going to project and speculate about what we might see with new structures in the park in the future. The first chapter begins with a story of the indigenous people who have lived here for thousands of years. I want to acknowledge that the land on which we live, work, and recreate today has been inhabited by people who most likely emigrated to North America over the Bering Sea land bridge. We honor all Native nations associated with the Boulder Valley, affirm their ancestral ties to their homeland, and acknowledge the history of mistreatment and forced removal that has had a devastating impact on their communities. Scientists estimate that human beings first came to North America in the aftermath of the Ice Age. In Boulder, archaeologists have found artifacts that date from roughly 13,000 years ago, that include stone tools. From then on, numerous indigenous tribes settled in Colorado. In fact, the Boulder Valley became an ideal region for tribes like the Utes, Cheyenne, Comanches, Arapaho, and Sioux to live for periods of time. Just a check. Are you hearing me okay? Okay, good, great. The Ute territory spanned all of Colorado for hundreds of years before white settlement. They acquired horses from the Spanish around the year 1600 and were among the first native people to have horses in significant numbers. Utes controlled the Colorado mountains and camped in teepees as they hunted buffalo, other wildlife, and foraged for fruit and vegetables. Teepees may have been the first structures on the site of what is now Central Park on the banks of Boulder Creek. And here you could just picture that on the banks of Boulder Creek with the foothills behind us. Maybe that's Long's Peak in the background, or you know, any number of mountains there. Members of the Arapaho tribe eventually came to present-day Boulder County and created an encampment near what is now Haystack Mountain. When the winter ended, they would return to the Great Plains to hunt buffalo, which was their primary means of sustenance. The full flowering of Plains Indian horse culture lasted little more than a century, roughly from the 1750s to the 1870s, when it was ended by the westward expansion of European settlers and the forced relocation of indigenous people to reservations. Here's some images of some of the Ute tribe members in Boulder. Moving on to the settlement by the Europeans. Here's a drawing of Boulder from 1874, just 15 years after white people arrived. I've highlighted the area on the southern edge of town where Central Park would be founded. And this area is Pearl Street. So the main cluster of town was Pearl Street, and on the edge were some woods, a forest along the creek, and then we even had our own Boot Hill up on the hill. It was a Wild West town with a cemetery up on the hill on the other side of the creek. Among the first permanent structures to be constructed in this area in 1871 were irrigation ditches. 50 years earlier, when the first American explorers came through the area, they considered it an uninhabitable desert. The irrigation ditches became essential to create the farms that would supply the mining towns in the foothills. Here you see the ditch that runs right through the middle of what became Central Park. And here's a view of that same diversion sluice wall 130 years later with the park you can see now behind it. And then here's a view of the ditch flowing through Central Park today. The other very early and important structures to be constructed were the train tracks and support buildings like the stations. And that is the old passenger train depot. The water tank towers that were used for the steam engines, and the tracks along Water Street. And it was called Water Street because it flooded often, not just in 1894, although that was a significant flood. And then these trees, this large group of trees, is the area that became Central Park, although it was completely changed in terms of the plantings. But for a long period of time, people got used to it as a remnant of the forest along the creek. And they called it Cigarette Park because they did a lot of smoking there. This blurry photo, and I'm sorry, but in this blurry photo, you can see a large building. That's a flour mill. This is Water Street. That is a train. And that's, again, that group of trees. And this area here is an assemblage of houses that over time became the red light district during Boulder's Wild West time period. And the next few photos highlight another important infrastructure addition to town, the bridges spanning Boulder Creek. So again, you see the trees here in the park. This is what we now call Broadway. It was known as 12th Street. So it was a primary buggies, wagons, horses. And then this bridge right here is a railroad bridge that brought people from the depot, which is right here, around and to the new university. This is a great picture of Boulder in the early days. That's Mapleton School, just 2 years old, up on the hill with almost nothing else up here. This is the Pearl Street area, and then the railroad tracks are winding around through this part of town. And then that's that flour mill. It's kind of a good large landmark to keep your eye on from time to time. There's that flour mill again, and here are a bunch of people standing on the bridge watching the flood go underneath them in 1894. I confess, I stood on the bridge across Boulder Creek in 2013 when the flood was running through there. So it's quite a thrill. And the area that became Central Park is there. So the bridges. So this is the first bridge that spanned Boulder Creek. And you can see it was a steel bridge with multiple spans. And then there's some mercantile buildings over here. And then this is just the edge of some greenhouses. And I'll talk about them in a minute. This is the second bridge, and it was built a lot more sturdy. It was built right before the park opened, and it spanned the creek with 2 spans, and it lasted till about 2005. And then the slide will advance. This bridge was built around 2005 with a single span over the creek. The diversion head wall for the ditch is right here. And this is where the greenhouses used to be. We're going to get to that in a minute. So people want to know when Boulder Central Park was made, were there any structures in the park? Well, there were 3 originally. There were 2 houses, and this is one, the J. Faust House on 12th Street, another house, and the greenhouses. And unfortunately, the J. Faust House was washed away, and this is it. It had been blown downstream from its location in 1894. This view is standing on Water Street with the railroad tracks in the foreground here. The Mackenzie House, which was a rooming house built almost dead center in the middle of the park. And then some of the other smaller buildings along 12th Street. So Mackenzie was a big name in town. He owned quite a bit of land. He developed the first oil wells in town. He had mines, and he built a beautiful house or lived in a house on 8th and Pine Street, which is still standing and is a landmark today. This is the view again during the flood. There were a lot of photos taken during the flood of this area. So that's the Mackenzie House. Here, people standing on looking at the edge of the creek as it's overflown, coming up into the middle of the park. That's the J. Faust House that's been, floated downstream and destroyed. So this is and it's the Story Mackenzie House. So it was built and then bought, built by somebody else and then bought by Mackenzie. It was run as a rooming house, and it changed over time, because when Boulder became a wild party town, this became a bordello for a period of about 20 years until the prohibition went into effect in 1907. And then it reverted back to a boarding house. It was a very substantial building, brick, and it lasted until it was physically torn down to make room for the park in the 1920s. But not before patrons like this, who were hanging out in the park, drinking their alcohol and heading over to the Mackenzie House for a party, posed for their picture. So a slice of time. And, if you change the clothes a little bit, you might find CU students doing the same thing come fall. So this is a good picture because it encapsulates three different things going on. This is the head wall for the ditch. That's the Mackenzie House in the park. And this is the beginning of the greenhouses that were built. So there was commerce and residential activities going on. This is the greenhouses were built way back in 1896. And what does that say about Boulder? It says that the town was looking to settle and become a place of culture, a place where people could grow their own vegetables, plant their flowers. You know, for years we've been going to Sturts and Copeland to get our plants to beautify our yards, and that's what the people of Boulder were trying to do. They're trying to civilize an area, and this was an important amenity for them in business. And here's a view of it on the storefront on 12th Street on Broadway. And you can see it's Say It With Flowers from the Henselmans, U of C Flower Shop. So they were already catering and advertising to the students and the people who worked on the university. And look at this great car. So the next series of photos is of the city storage building. And the city storage and transfer building was part of the train experience of Boulder. When goods were brought into town, they needed a place to warehouse them. And this building was built on 13th Street to warehouse supplies, and then they would be redistributed to either go into town or up into the mining areas. So you know this building as something else, but I'll get to that in a minute. This is a view across the brand new Central Park. When there was no band shell, the band shell would have been built right here. But here is that city transfer and storage building, and it stayed there until the 1970s. In fact, it was the home of the owners. So they lived there and they had their shop below. This building is a gasification plant, and I'll talk about that in a minute. So you get an idea, there was heavy industry, gas plants, there was a warehouse, and because I'm an architect, I know that the current trends in construction in Colorado in 2024 are that the building type that is the most popular in getting constructed right now is warehouses. And that says a lot about distribution of materials and the growth that we're seeing in Colorado. And that was happening in Boulder at the time, the distribution of materials and the growth of the community. So in the 50s, people wanted to do a makeover. A lot of that happened on the Pearl Street area, where they covered up the beautiful old brick buildings with aluminum metal siding to modernize. And this was the attempt to modernize the city storage and transfer building in the 50s by painting it. And then in the 1970s, the building was sold to the city of Boulder. And since then, the building has been the home of the Boulder Arts Center, the Boulder Center for the Visual Arts, and the Boulder Museum, now the Boulder Museum of Contemporary Art. It was made a city landmark in 1992. Earlier this year, if you've been following information about BMOCA, is they announced a plan to construct a new museum in North Boulder in the Holiday neighborhood. So there's quite a bit of speculation right now about what the next use of the building might be. And everybody has different ideas of what could show up here. Another museum, a children's museum, a shelter for homeless people, office space, arts, more arts related creative things. So stay tuned on that and let's see what happens with that. Just to the south of BMOCA are these few buildings that extend to Arapahoe Street. And while they're not significant historically, they still have their own stories to tell about Boulder. So this first one, even when this photo was taken, it was a maintenance building owned by the city of Boulder. And it's been beautified with some new facades to create more of a little storefront feel to the building. And then next to it is this building. They're very proud of their address. It's bigger than the name of the business. They wanted people to know where to go to the Farmers Insurance Agency. And to this day, it's still a professional office space. The Boulder Lending Group is here. A couple of other buildings that have survived since the early part of the 20th century are these along Broadway. For years, they were the location of Yoakum's photography studio. And they were repurposed by architect Charles Hartling in the 1970s for office space. You can also see that's a billboard. There was a giant billboard right at the bottom of Broadway. I would love to know see a photo of what that once said. But welcome to downtown Boulder. And here's the building today. It's the Riverside building. It's an event center right on the creek. And also, the architect Charles Hartling had his office here. So the next series of slides illustrates the original master plan for the entire civic area and the specific design of Central Park by the famous Olmsted Brothers Company from Boston. Their family designed Central Park, Prospect Park, the Great Park in Montreal, a lot of the parks in Washington, D.C. They created the idea for Yosemite National Park and helped to lay out that park as well. And so it was kind of mind-blowing that they were brought to this tiny little town of about 10,000 people to do a master plan. And this was the plan that was shot down by the citizens of Boulder. It was put up to a vote, and they said, "You're reaching. It's too much. We don't have that much money." But it extended from about where Boulder High is, all the way along the creek, up past that Riverside building to where Central Park is now. The municipal building was designated to be in this spot, and then all the way over to 9th Street. It was a long linear park along the creek. And this is what the citizens were able to bite off initially. And this was Central Park. In 1924, this is the planting plan for the park. This is 13th Street along here. There was a lot of heavier vegetation along 13th Street, a walkway along the creek, and then a crisscrossing walkway up along Water Street at the time. And many of the original features of the Olmsted design of Central Park remain to this day, including that line of trees along 13th Street. And some of these are original from 100 years ago. The lawn area is actually slightly elevated. Whenever you walk up to the park, you have to take a few steps up, like 4 feet, to get up to the park. It just is a psychological way to leave the city behind and enter into a higher plane of the park. Another aspect of the park design was that there were view corridors maintained because there were fewer trees suggested on that other side of the park. So you would get little peekaboo views to the Flatirons, and those remain to this day. And of course, what would we be on a day like this without shade pockets in the park? And so along with the row of trees along 13th Street, there were certain areas in the park where there were designated trees that would create pockets of shade. And this photo was taken recently, and here was a group of campers, little kids in the park, in the shade, getting ready to have a fun event. Of course, we have the pedestrian path along the street, and this has been modified over time because now it's a bike path that goes under Arapahoe and connects to the creek path. And then there's this kind of hidden little treasure, this rock boulder wall, pair of walls here with a ramp for access down to the creek and some steps here and benches. So that is, again, part of the aspects of the original Olmsted design. From the 1930s through the 1950s, the Denver planner, Sacco de Boer, took over the design of Central Park. He elaborated on the plans of the Olmsted Company by sketching the City Hall building. He literally sketched it. It's like a T-shaped building there. He proposed a war memorial building on the other side of the creek, along with a baseball field. And he proposed the band shell to be here. So instead of the original war memorial that was here, he proposed the band shell here. And the Boulder Lions Club donated the effort and funds to construct the band shell. Their headquarters was in Indiana, and they initially hired a Chicago engineer to design the structure. They wanted it to resemble the Art Deco band shell that had been recently completed in Grant Park in Chicago. It looks just like ours, right? It's just 5 times bigger, but it's very similar. And it's expressive of the post-Depression era where Americans were trying to be happy and be exuberant and expressive and dramatic. And this telescoping, radiating, rainbow-like form was copied all over the country. And here's our band shell, right about 1940. There were no seats here. It was just a grass lawn. There was no municipal building. These are some of the old mercantile buildings here. And there's some train tracks still running through here. So no seating yet. And I would say that, you know, people complain nowadays that the band shell is noisy, but can you imagine going to an event here and the trains are going down the street here, and there were streetcars that ran up and down 12th Street, plus the horses and buggies and the beginning of the cars. I think, in fact, it's going to get quieter and quieter as we move more and more to electric vehicles and get people out of their cars. So this is a view now with people enjoying the seating that was built in the 1950s. And I think what's going on in the stage is sort of a powwow dance with native indigenous people in some headdresses. So I wanted to spend a little time to talk about the architect who designed the band shell, because I'm an architect junkie and I like to talk about architects. And this man, Glenn Huntington, was really the grandfather of modern architecture, of innovative architecture in Boulder. He designed, and his firm designed, the Boulder County Courthouse, Boulder High School. This is an apartment building on University Hill that looks like it came out of Germany, you know, I mean, very international looking. And then look at that theater in Boulder High School. That is actually 2 years earlier than the band shell. So he was already thinking about that kind of radiating arch design. And his firm then led to the firm of James Hunter, and we'll be talking about him. And James Hunter had people in his firm that were Hobart Wagner, Charles Hartling, Tish Papachristo, the next generation of the modernists in Boulder. So he was a pretty important figure in the world of architecture. And so here you see the building today, and I have to give credit to the Parks Department, because once the building was landmarked in 1995, and I was involved in, actually submitted the application for that landmarking. The Parks Department has really stepped up to get more programming in the band shell and to keep it up, especially in more recent years. It has been, as you know, an attraction for homeless people as a day shelter, and that's a struggle for the city. It's a social issue, but it seems like a magnet in other ways for culture. The next series of photos I'm going to focus on are about the municipal building. And these are the buildings that were on the site where the municipal building was going to be. And this is Rocky Mountain Joe Sturdivant's photography studio. And right across the street, I'm pointing over here, is Yoakum's studio. So they had the market of, photography in town. And this is looking up 12th Street toward Pearl. And let's see. So, sorry. The City Hall, you might want to know where it was before it ended up here. It was on Pearl Street, Pearl and 14th Streets. It initially included government offices and a fire station. And in November of 1945, there was a $225,000 bond for a new municipal building that was passed. And it was to include a city hall, a library, and a museum. As you know, it wasn't able to maintain all of those pieces. This is the first design for that city hall, and it was designed by Harold Jones, architect. Harold Jones was James Hunter's and Glenn Huntington's partner. Then they split up and went 3 different ways, and Jones designed something that looked like it could be on the university campus, more of an Italian style, very rooted in classicism and conservative. 5 years later, however, his former business partner, James Hunter, came up with this design, which was more embraced by the city because they wanted, at that point in time, Boulder in the 50s and the 40s, they were coming out of World War II, and they wanted to express that Boulder was a place of innovation and progress. And they wanted a building that was going to express that. And this is been labeled as part of that international style of architecture with the flat roofs and the horizontal bands of windows and that curving front stone element. And here's a building that predates it from Paris by one of the 3 masters of the modern movement, Le Corbusier. Same kind of idea with a curving shape with the rusticated stone here. And so what it says is that these guys, these architects, these small town architects in Boulder, Colorado, were aware of what was going on and cared enough to learn about what were the most interesting new ideas in innovative and progressive design. So this is James Hunter, the only one allowed to look at the camera. Hobart Wagner, who became the most successful modern era architect. He designed over 200 buildings in Boulder. That's the rendering of the municipal building sitting up on that ledge. And what we are not seeing in here is Margaret Reed. So Margaret Reed was the first woman architect in Boulder, and she worked in this firm, and she worked in Glenn Huntington's firm. These are some of the buildings that the James Hunter's firm designed. So we're in this building right now. This was a Masonic temple before it was this museum. And it kind of bookended the municipal building on either end of Broadway from downtown. This is Baseline Middle or Junior High School. It's going to be torn down next year because they're building a new school on this property for New Vista. This is the colonnade along the front of the Boulder Public Library. So they eventually did build a library near the municipal building, but not connected to it. And that's the Boulder Medical Center. And this building is still here today, but they've had the top was popped. So Hunter designed that, and the top was popped in a design by Hobart Wagner years later. So when the first construction bid costs were announced for the municipal building, the project was way over budget. Revisions were made by eliminating the museum, the library, a basement, and a proposed pistol range in the building. The groundbreaking ceremony was held in August of 1951. There's Mr. Hunter and city fathers and somebody from the clergy. That's the way things were done in the 50s. Here you can see the building under construction. The windows aren't even put in here yet, and they have scaffolding out in front. And the building opened, and this was the grand opening ribbon cutting ceremony with a band in the foreground and dignitaries speaking and lots of flags, and a railroad building across the street and a train still there on Water Street. I don't think it had become Canyon yet. So this is two pictures of the building, the front on the left and the back on the right. The building was only 12,600 square feet. It was 160 feet long. It had 42 rooms, including a council chamber, a lounge, public lounge, the main lobby, city offices, and a city jail. The curving stone wall was meant to be a backdrop for civic ceremonies in the front. And there was supposed to be a 30-foot by 70-foot reflecting pool in front of that, but it was cut out because they didn't have the money for it. And then the picture on the right shows the building before an addition was added right here. And this is a big picture window on the second floor that was a lounge off of the city council space. And here's an aerial view now of the building with no addition on the back, band shell and the seating here, the train station here. There were no tracks here at this time, and there was a bank building here. So that's what was going on in around 1958. Here's some interior views. So the front of the building is where on Broadway you used to enter into that on either side of that curving wall. And you would come into the lobby space, and there was this beautiful stone, and there still is to this day, stone walls. And then you would arrive up on the second floor with this big picture window with almost like a Mondrian pattern, modernist pattern, looking out to your backyard, right? And then here's a view from 1962, once the addition was built in the back. And Hunter did this, he did more horizontal shaped windows, and Wagner did more vertical shaped windows. So you can kind of see that even at the Boulder Medical Center, you can see a little bit of that going on. Of even more importance than the architecture, though, is that there were decades of important government policies accomplished here. And of note is that the first African-American to be mayor, Penfield Tate, was alive in this era. And there he is pictured in this photo being sworn in. In 1972, the city council adopted, and this is also important historically, the first Boulder Human Rights Ordinance. This trailblazing ordinance added protections against employment discrimination based on sexual orientation. However, in 1974, a referendum by the citizens removed the specific language on sexual orientation from the law, and they also voted to try to expel some of the people who had voted for that ordinance. And one person was expelled, Tim Fuller, who was an openly gay man. And the only one not wearing a tie in this picture. And then here you see Penfield Tate. And then this gentleman right here is Charles Hartley. He was a city council member, but he was also, I think, one of the best architects who's ever worked in Boulder. The building was landmarked in 2009 and was renamed the Penfield Tate Municipal Building in 2021. With the current proposed move of city offices to the development plan for the old Boulder Hospital site on Alpine and Balsam and Broadway, the future of the municipal building is up in the air. It may not be a government building in the future. We'll just have to wait and see. All right, a little sideways story. This is Engine 30. It's coal carrier. This is a coach, and there was a caboose. And it was put in the park in 1953 as a way to commemorate the mining history of Boulder. It was a narrow gauge railroad type apparatus. But some good things are not meant to be in that park. Somebody put dynamite in here and blew it up in 1958. So they pulled that out. They cleaned it up. They moved it around. But still, there was vandalism off and on over the years. So by, I think, 2004, the train was removed, and engine number 30 is on a long-term loan from Boulder to the train museum in Golden. The coach has been used on the Georgetown Loop Trail Railroad. So it's been split up. The next series of slides covers the story of the Midland Savings Bank on the site across from the bandshell. And there was a lumber mill here next to the gasification plant alongside the train tracks. And here's a view of the Moss and Bradfield Lumber Company. But by the middle 60s, the Midland Savings Bank, which was building many branches in the suburbs of Denver, wanted to put a branch bank here. And so they tore the building down. And this is the conceptual rendering of the proposed Midland Savings and Loan branch. It was designed by the architecture firm of Hobart Wagner. And the design is really unusual for banks, when oftentimes you think of them as little Greek temples or Roman temples, more conservative looking. And this was anything but conservative. It was kind of radical for its time. But in other ways, it was even more ancient than the Greek temples. It was like the Greek pyramids. It was an elemental form of architecture. And just a kind of a squashed pyramid, but it's still the same solidity and ancient qualities to it. Another idea for the precedent of this building is the dollar bill and the Mason's iconic eye on the apex of the pyramid. And there's a triangular shape on the apex of this building. So what could be better than a bank building? And also, that apex is a skylight. And you know, I'm stretching things here, of course, to make a point. But the Pantheon in Rome has this amazing oculus at the top that brings tremendous light into the space. And this skylight had the same function. Yeah, thank you. Yes. But, you know, architects sit in lectures about the history of design. And we start with Babylon and Egypt and Rome. And so it's not a far stretch for somebody like Hobart Wagner to think about utilizing pyramidal shapes. And he used them on several buildings, including his own home. This is just a fun graphic. This is an artistic conception of what the building would look like and when it opened in 1969. It's just kind of that, wow, Peter Max, Beatles, pop art kind of look to the building. And an important thing about the Midland Savings and Loan is that it provided low interest, affordable mortgages for working class people. And Boulder was growing hugely in the 60s and 70s. And so banks like this made it possible for average people like teachers and architects to be able to afford a house in Boulder. And so it had an important role. However, two stories about Midland Savings Bank. Prior to 1969, when the Fair Housing Law was put into effect, they denied mortgages to people of color. So this building was built after that. So that shouldn't have been happening in this building during its lifetime. And the other thing is, in the 80s, the Midlands banking system went belly up through all sorts of financial misdoings. And so it became available, for the city of Boulder to buy. I'm going to show an image of images of the work, some of the other work of Hobart Wagner's firm. So that's Fairview High School, which was kind of wildly scientific and progressive at the time. Here's another pyramid building and the towers at Williams Village. The pyramid's been torn down. That was the student union there. This is the Ball Brothers tower and laboratory buildings. These buildings are almost all supposed to be torn down to create parking for the new labs that are going to be built at Ball Aerospace. And this is the addition to the Methodist Church just around the corner here on Walnut Street. So they were very inventive in a whole gamut of project types. So when Midland sold the building to the city of Boulder, the city needed the space because the population was growing so much that Boulder needed more office space in town. And they moved into this building, they renamed it to Atrium, and it became offices for government workers. In 2022, the City Landmarks Board and the council walked the talk of valuing their own property and landmarked it. And this is a really courageous action because people were thinking about tearing this building down and putting up housing here. So, and in our efforts to win their minds about landmarking it, we worked with an architect named Kirk Hill to envision how the interior might be redone to create a multi-purpose space that could be used for farmers markets or performances or other community activities. And it's really helpful, even in historic preservation, to have people understand that preservationists don't want to freeze a building in time. They want buildings to have new life. And we help people visualize how that could be done. Another building that was constructed in this neighborhood to be close to the government center is the Park Central building. Another modernist international style building. It was always designed for office space for the city government. It's where you would go to get your building permits. And this is a rendering of what the building looked like back in 1972. And this is the view of it today, right on the edge of the Boulder Creek. I'm going to talk about this building next. How many of you have had a guilty pleasure of having Mustard's Last Stand? Yeah. So Mustard's Last Stand was known as the home of the Bush Burger. Bush's Drive-In in 1955 was built on that site. And as a part of the city's re-examining of the properties in this area, including the Park Central building, and with the potentially moving city offices out of the area, they're planning to tear not only the Park Central building down, but the Mustard's Last Stand. And I received an email last week from the head of the Chamber of Commerce saying that the owner of this building wanted to meet with me because he doesn't want this building to be torn down. He would love it if this building could be turned back into that look again and be an anchor in the new expanded park. So hopefully we'll work to lobby the city Parks Department to see if they can leave that one building there. The next structure of sorts is the Sister Cities Plaza in front of the municipal building. And you can see this almost like tic-tac-toe of diamonds of all the different cities here. In 1982, the Boulder Sister Cities program began, and it's developed relationships with several international communities. The program is made up of volunteers who believe that through mutual respect and cooperation, people worlds apart form relationships that foster peace and prosperity. The plaza is made up of artistic stone and metal inlay squares representing each of the sisters. The design of the squares represents unique geographic and cultural features exclusive to each city. And I picked this one because this is a great lead into the next structure of importance and landmark in the Central Park area, the Dushanbe Tea House. The Boulder Sister Cities was begun when Mary Hay and Sophia Stoller lobbied to have Dushanbe be a sister city. And it had been chosen for its similarities to Boulder. Both are at the same latitude, both have universities, both are surrounded by high white-capped mountains. And remarkably, Tajikistan at that time was part of the Soviet Union. So we were negotiating with a Soviet bloc country, which at the time was described by Ronald Reagan as the evil empire. The site of the tea house is the location of the former coal plant where gas was produced for the street lamps in town. To this day, there's a lot of contaminated soil underneath the plaza north of the tea house. So this is the storage building, the BMOCA building. The tea house is built here, and then the atrium building was built here. Here's another view of that gasification plant. It's hard to picture that we would have something that looks like Commerce City right here in downtown Boulder, but we certainly did for a period of time. And then here's another view of the building with the ditch running behind it. So that ditch today is right next to the Dushanbe Tea House. And in 1987, during his first visit to Boulder, the mayor of Dushanbe signed the Sister City Agreement, and he announced that they planned to present Boulder with a tea house, a traditional tea house, to celebrate the establishment of our sister city ties. And so for the next 3 years, more than 40 artisans in Tajikistan created the decorative elements of the tea house, including the hand-carved interior elements, the ceiling, the tables, the columns, and the exterior panels. In 1990, the tea house was disassembled in Tajikistan, packed into 200 shipping containers, and sent to Boulder, where it sat for 7 years until they could raise the money to be able to build the building. And the doors opened in 1998, and the restaurant is successfully operated by Three Leaf Concepts and has become one of the favorite tourist destinations in town. In 2020, it was declared an official city landmark, which broke the rules because usually a building had to be 50 years or older, and this was only 20 years old. But everybody thought it was such an important treasure that they wanted it landmarked. And it also broke the rules because they landmarked the interior as well to make sure that there would be protection in case they wanted to remodel it. That doesn't mean they can't remodel it. It just means that it needs to go through a review process like the exterior. So what did Tajikistan get in return? Boulder promised them a cafe, and this is a cyber cafe. Everybody thought that was cool, cyber cafe, and with solar panels out in front. And it opened up in 2008. So I want to mention the last noteworthy structure currently in the park, and that's the Gilbert White Memorial. It's just, I'm trying to get my direction, just east of the Broadway Bridge, and it's a series of stacked pieces of glass. It's quite beautiful and elegant, and it actually measures where the 100-year flood is, and the 250-year flood, and the 500-year flood is. And Mr. White was one of the leading experts in the country on the science of flooding and mitigating flooding. So I just want to thank you for hanging in there with me as I'm telling the story of Central Park. I'm going to start the final chapter now, and it's to try to understand what might be coming in the park and around the park. And these buildings are a really good indication of what might be coming. Like many town squares, Central Park has become a beautiful amenity for the town and an attractive place for commercial development. Across the street, there's been a continued growth of new buildings, some office and some residential. They're a pretty good indication of how tall you can build a building, how the materiality of the buildings that might be showing up in the area around the periphery of the park. And Another indicator is this. This is the University Hotel, Conference Center, and parking garage that are being built on the hill right at University and Broadway, perfectly in access of 13th Street, which is really important because a lot of people, university people, commercial people, and city government people are trying to figure out how to make a connection to the university to try to attract people down 13th Street all the way up to Pearl Street and make that connection to link the university and the community and the commerce. These are some of the designs that have been proposed for Central Park and the larger Civic Center area, and I'm going to go through them. This is one from 2015, and notably, this is Central Park. There's no bandshell left in this version. They wanted to extend a multimodal bike lane up to Canyon, and they were even talking about reducing Canyon from 4 lanes to 2, and then have a bike lane running the length of Canyon. So the other thing that was you'll see in all of these proposals is this is the landmarked city storage building, and that's the tea house. And then these buildings are future buildings that would be built 3, 4, possibly 5 stories with housing, affordable housing, artist housing, I've heard, and retail and other art spaces. This is a bigger overall view from 14th Street through Central Park into the Civic Center area, past the library, all the way to 9th Street. You can see a big kind of circular area in the park. The buildings along Broadway torn down, the Park Central building, and then again, kind of a C-shaped building, a group of buildings along 14th Street. And there's also conversations about linking across to the bus station and possibly moving the bus station. This is a zoom in of that area. So that's the city storage building, Duchambe Tea House, and then a series of buildings that wrap around with plazas that would connect all the way through to a series of developments as you move further east. So that was the Russell Mills design. This is the Ion design. The idea was to develop the public library into a mixed-use arts center, tear down that portion, the original portion of the library, and put a theater, an arts theater here, and have a parking here and connect over to the cultural pad next to the St. Julian. They had an idea of moving a bandshell or putting the bandshell here in the park. They actually looking at, it looks like the atrium's moved here to this location. So they're shuffling things around, and then they're taking 13th Street and just adding a little curve, maybe a little sexy curve to it. And I think a colonnade, a covered area so that it could be protected and used more year round. And then this is a little blow up of that area. So an enlarged view of the park, the ditch running through it, and then different events. This is very conceptual. And so these are ideas that have been going on for the past 10 years and will continue. This is a really wild one. This is a company from Seattle, and they've got these kind of like boomerang forms that are bridges. They're park bridges where you could walk on grass areas over Broadway, over Canyon, over 9th Street. Just, people just thinking outside of the box. What might you do to celebrate the parkness of this area and still have a development at each of the, what they call these, the bookends, east and west bookend. And then this is just a blow up, zooming in. They kept the bandshell in this case. So thank you very much. And then the current company that's been hired by the city is called Rios. They're an international firm. They have a local branch office. And this was kind of a just cartoon sketch that they did to envision a variety of things that might be going on to animate your imagination it isn't literally that this is what was going to happen, but it helps people to loosen up. And they are working right now on fact finding this year in 2024. And then in 2025, they're going to lay out the proposed improvements to Central Park and envision how 13th Street and maybe the area behind along 14th Street could be redeveloped. So I'm concluding. It's been my intention tonight to impress on you the rich and varied stories of the structures that have existed in the area around and including Central Park. They illustrate the evolution of Boulder from an area of transitory habitation to a place known worldwide as a leading center of innovation in science, education, and the environment. It's my hope that this area, including Central Park, will be made an official historic district to honor the past, the present, and the future history as embodied in the structures in this very historic neighborhood. Thank you. Questions, anybody? Comments? Yeah.
So I was just wondering when the UN was built, because some of the buildings in that period of, the mid-century reminded me of the United Nations Plaza in its front. It's a great connection. So the original design for the United Nations was by Le Corbusier, the same architect who designed that building in Paris that influenced the design of our municipal building. So, and that was after World War II, it was built. The developer was William Zeckendorf, who assembled all the land. And Wallace Harrison was the architect who was brought in to actually make it happen.
Here's what I found.
And what else? Oh, and Zeckendorf also did development work in Denver, the Mile High Center, where the Maybe F Tower was, and he hired I.M. Pei, who was his in-house architect. He was just for the Zeckendorfs to design some of the first major developments and redevelopments of downtown Denver. So you have a great eye and memory to think about the UN in that.
Well, I grew up, so, it's hard not to know that.
I don't have a question. There's so much here that I couldn't think of a question, but I can say, wow. And what a great way to walk down Pine Street and have a learning experience.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, the photographs.
Yeah, thanks. There's an exhibit here that talks about more about the Central Park than just the structures that I was focusing on. This exhibit will be up here till the 19th of August. So take some time to read about the people. It's really more person oriented, and their stories are really great as well. Yeah.
Which corner on 8th and Pine is Mackenzie?
So,
Or is it obvious?
yes, it is obvious. It's the one with the turret, the tower in the front. It's a Victorian building. It's on a triple large lot.
Northeast.
It's in the northeast corner.
Okay.
Yeah.
Does it have a plaque or it's just?
It's a landmark, and it's for sale, and it can be yours for $10 million. It is for sale.
But
Yeah.
it is fixed.
Yeah, and
Yeah,
a
it is.
funny thing also, the first oil well in Boulder is the Mackenzie oil well, and it was landmark. So landmarking isn't only buildings, it can be objects, it can be signs, and it can be parks. Yeah, and that Mackenzie well is out just as you're heading on the Boulder on the Diagonal Highway, where they built that new subdivision development there. And so that well is right there. Question?
Yeah, there also is that infinite walk-up piece that includes the sister city plaza that nobody knows about. It's just signage, but it's hope that that's going to be better. I think that was a beautiful presentation.
Okay, thanks. Yeah. Anyone else? Yeah.
So in the 1850s, when people were sledding or beginning to come out here, where do they come from and who were they? after the miners?
Well, it was primarily the miners for the first 20 years, and their families were coming from Missouri, Kansas, you know, after the Civil War. And the first people came in 1859, and they had a gentleman's agreement with Chief Niwot, the Arapaho chief, that they would just stay the winter while they were going to go up and explore and try to find gold. And they stayed up at Settlers Rocks, which is now called People's Crossing. And they broke that promise because they found gold that winter, and they founded Boulder that spring in town. And it was really the beginning of the terrible troubles between the American settlers and the people who were living there, the indigenous people. And farmers came because they needed to grow supplies and crops to feed the people up in the north. The mining went on in various different forms: gold, silver, tellurium, which is a form of gold, and then tungsten up in Netherlands. Tungsten, I think, was going on up through World War II almost. So there was mining going on for long periods of time.
So did they come from any particular part of rest of the country and or Europe, or where did they all come
Well,
from?
for instance, people came from Scotland, people came from Boston. We just had a historic Boulder member party at a house that was built Island Street by a Massachusetts resident. Yeah, they came from mostly the East Coast.
Mining supplies was a big business in Boulder. Lots of firms, hardware firms, machinery and stuff. Supply all those mines.
Yeah, that whole area.
Bob Betcher, his building.
Yeah, the Betcher building right on Broadway in Pearl. He was part of the mining industry. If you followed Pearl Street out, that's how you would get up to the mountains. Canyon didn't go through. And that area had smelting plants and assay offices. So Lolita's Market was a gold assay office. An assay is where they would bring the ore to test its value, whether it had high or low content of gold or silver. It was really dirty. There was a lot of heavy industry in the area. There were, again, flour mills, blacksmith shops. It was a rough and tumble frontier town. Kind of cool. We're living that cowboy, Wild West, and look how far the town has come. In large part, I'd say, because the university showed up here, and then in the 50s, when NIST, the Bureau of Standards, showed up here, then a lot of scientific research started showing up, and then companies like IBM and Storage Tech started showing up here too. Yeah.
Leonard, what style is this building that we're in? Is it brutalist or is this a Hunter building, did you say?
This is a James Hunter design, and people have said that it's an international style building. It doesn't have the raw ruggedness of the brutalist style, which is what NCAR is. All concrete and rough texture, and it's a little bit more machine looking, which is more related to the international style. And we do have, Historic Boulder has created a couple walking tours that you can do in an app called Pocket Sites. It's an app. You can either find it on the internet or find it on your phone. And you can do a self-guided tour of mid-century modern buildings, including this one, and your municipal building, and theater, and a number of other buildings in Central Boulder area. We also have a walking tour of the African American neighborhood called the Little Rectangle. We have a walking tour of the Civic Center area, and we have a new walking tour of Table Mesa, believe it or not, mid-century modernism. We're working to put our more traditional tours like Mapleton Hill on these apps too. So if anybody wants to volunteer and help us, we love to help. Yeah.
What are the implications of the district not being the civics
Good question.
and can it go down? Can they demo?
No, they can't. So it's a great question. So earlier this year and for the past 2 years, Historic Boulder's been working with other organizations to try to create that neighborhood as an actual historic district. And the city council voted convincing not to move forward with that until the Parks Department comes through with their new redesign of the area, because they said they didn't want to have their hands tied, which really doesn't say a lot about how well they get along with their own preservation department in the city. There are buildings already landmarked. So the municipal building is landmarked and protected. And the only way that it could be torn down is if the city would turn around and take away its landmark status. It's never been done, but it's possible. So the building that BMOCA is in is landmarked and it can't be torn down. The atrium building is landmarked, it can't be torn down, nor the band shell, and there's a tea house. So they all have to remain there, but it doesn't mean they can't be reused, repurposed, or added on to. So that's likely what would happen. If they vacated those buildings, they'll be reused and probably have something potentially added on.
I recently learned about a connection between Seattle and Homestead. I didn't know that part of the original part of the University of Washington was Homestead until like a month ago.
Yeah.
And so since that, I thought of it because you had put that last slide with the firm from Seattle. That has been chosen, that firm?
No, so that was,
One of the-
yeah, that was one of the firms that had proposed ideas over the past 10 years, but
They're not chosen.
no, but there is a firm, Rios is chosen.
Okay.
Yeah, so they are chosen.
The
The
one with
chosen
the
firm.
walkway.
Pardon?
The boomerangs or.
No, not with the Boomers. Yeah. Let me see if I can go back. Just a couple slides. This one. This is the firm that is currently doing the design work. And the one you were thinking of was this one. So, and the Olmsteds, so the Olmsteds are multiple generations. There was Frederick Law Olmsted Sr., and he was the first true planner and landscape architect in the country and had the most successful practice designing Central Park and other major parks. And then his son and I believe stepson were the next generation that took over. And it was Frederick Law Olmsted Jr., that guy right there, who came to Boulder and walked it, biked it, hiked it for months, studying it, and then came up with the original master plan. Not just for Central Park, not just for Civic Park, but all of Boulder. In fact, he was the one who proposed the idea of not having any development in the foothills. The blue line, it was really his idea. And the open space, agricultural open space, it was his idea to keep farm areas intact so they didn't get suburbanized, so that farm life could continue to supply the region, the county. So Olmsted was significant. He also had a dark side because he was associated with developments, particularly in New England, that were restrictive in not allowing Black people and Jewish people to move into them. So his beginning is earned a black eye. But from what he's done in Boulder, there's nothing that we've seen that was exclusionary of any of his writings or ideas. The top part was that whenever parks are made, people are displaced. And that was true in Boulder, as is true in Central Park in New York, and every other park around the country. And usually they're the most unfortunate, minority groups of people. And that neighborhood, in particular, if you read it, had quite a few African Americans living there. And get the full value of their property if they owned it when they sold it. So it was really an unfair time for them.
So you made reference to two irrigation ditches. And most of what you've talked about has been above ground. Shed any light on why and where they go and it's meant to be an open-ended question.
Yeah.
But you can just say no.
Yeah, I can't, but there are, in fact, I think there was Michael Holleran wrote the history of the ditches in Boulder County. And so you might try to Google Michael Holleran and find that out. What's interesting also is in Olmsted's first design for the park, Central Park, he wanted to put the irrigation ditch in a culvert and have the lawn extend uninterrupted across the park. So that was his first design. And you see that nowadays they disappear and then they reappear. Look at the ditch out at Google headquarters. That was buried over for a long time. And then when they redid Google, they brought it back to daylight. And it's a beautiful little area.
Farmers Ditch was underground right by North Boulder Park.
Yeah.
It was shut down a couple of weeks ago because part of 9th Street was getting eroded. Or to stop flowing while they figured out what was going on into 9th Street.
Well, you and I live on Pine Street and just a few houses up. If you see on Pine Street, the water is seeping through the street from the irrigation ditch.
Yeah.
Some maintenance will have to be done at some point in time when they,
I was emailing with the ditch company about that in the last 2 weeks.
yeah, you got the ditch running behind your house.
It's not today though.
Yeah,
I came back from the mountains and my ditch isn't running.
Does that water problem arise from runoff down the mountainside that can't be contained in the spring? I mean, what's the source of that problem?
the source of the problem is aging infrastructure. And so culverts under the roads are cracking. That's the issue. It's not the amount of water that's flowing down from the
Just
snow
not a
belt.
seasonal thing.
Yes. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you. And
Okay, thank you.
Bill, I'm going to leave this on the chair. These are flyers about historic Boulder. So if you want some information.